And welcome to everyone who has joined us. Looking forward to another great webinar, and we appreciate everyone who's come far and wide for this webinar series. Looks like a great conversation ahead of us today. Lessons from 18 years of community conferencing and restorative practices in Baltimore. And our guest speaker with us today is Lauren Abramson, who's been doing some incredible work with RJ at a community level, and we're going to hear some more about that in her experience over the last few decades with that. Lauren comes with, as I said, multiple experiences. She's had 20 years of experience in restorative practices in general. She is the founding director of the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore, Maryland, which has really become, sort of a stable, centered place where many of us refer to when we think about restorative justice, particularly in the urban center, but at a community base. She has worked over the years at a multi-sectoral restorative justice program, which many of us are talking about now, but Lauren has been doing, and that is sort of this sense of bringing in many sectors, many different groups and stakeholders, if you will, or those interested parties, particularly as it relates to building that sense of community, that community development in disinvested urban American communities, such as Baltimore, parts of Baltimore. She's advanced the use of conferencing in all types of human endeavors as a means of using conflict as a stepping stone to building community. And she provides restorative justice training across the United States and has convened peer learning community around community conferencing practice and program for many of those years. What makes Lauren particularly suited for this work and her ability to bring many sectors together is her background also in education, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavior Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. I was just looking over her resume around her published works, and she's done a great deal of publishing, both within in the psychiatric field, but also and bringing them together within this whole realm of community building, community conflict, and restorative community practices. And so this is very exciting to have you with us, Lauren. Most recently, Lauren has turned her attention to issues related to the development of restorative justice and practices, or a movement, including building more viable programs. Values-based growth and the illusion of technique is something that she's going to speak to, I hope, today, and extending the use of restorative justice more broadly for serious crimes. So I think we're in for a really rich conversation, and I'm encouraging those of you who have joined us and are listening in to start jotting down the questions you have and any comments you have, and send them through at any point along the way. As Jordan has already said, we will try to take as many of those, hopefully all of those questions and comments, and bring them to the fore and ask them and interact with them a little bit later in the program. But what we're going to do right now is turn some of our attention and time over to Lauren, as she will sort of frame what she wants to say today, and then we'll move into some time of discussion. Lauren, welcome. Really great to have you here, and thank you for taking the time to be with us and share from your heart and experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. It's really, I was so excited to be invited and to be community that you all have built across the world through EMU. So thank you so much. So shall I launch into just what I'd like to do is just sort of give a little bit of background about what we've been doing in the context in which we've been doing it. And hopefully I won't talk too long so that we'll have a lot of time for discussion, but I'm just gonna share my screen with everybody and go through just a little bit of background. Can you see that now? Okay. I really like this quote. I don't know how many people have seen the HBO series called The Wire, which is based was based in Baltimore. But the creator of The Wire, David Simon, talks about this a lot, and I think he actually got this from Winston Churchill. But that we are shaped by the institutions that govern us, and I think that those of us that are doing restorative justice work, it's really helpful to, and most of us have done a pretty serious examination of the institutions that are shaping us and the ways that they're also failing us. And I'd like to put that in a little context from my hometown, which is Detroit. I grew up in the 60s in Detroit, and this is a picture of the old Packard plant where they used to make cars. And it was thriving. Obviously, Detroit, the biggest employer in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and partly into the 70s, was the auto industry. And this is the Packard plant now. So if you'll bear with me with a little bit of a different perspective on this, I really got a good part of my appreciation of the context in which we do restorative justice work from actually an organizer from Detroit, a woman named Grace Lee Boggs, who was a communist labor organizer in the 50s, she and her husband, and then they were civil rights activists in the 60s. And in the last several decades, what she's been talking a lot about is the fact that our institutions are hugely failing us, that the means of production, she says the factory jobs that people used to have are not going to come back. We have huge amounts of people who are unemployed, and the jobs that people used to have no longer exist. She talks about how our education system is failing us. It's based on, from the early 1900s, an education system that was built to create good factory workers, basically. And our criminal justice system, we all know, is hugely overburdened. It's costly, and it's hugely biased based on how much money you have and what color your skin is. And so what Grace Lee Boggs says in this book, which she wrote when she was 97, and she recently passed away at 100, she said the next American Revolution is not going to be about equality, that it's going to be about who we are as human beings. And to me, that gives a context for restorative justice work, because in so many ways across any sector of human endeavor, restorative practices give us a way to define who we are as human beings and how are we going to be with each other. So since 1998, I learned about conferencing in 1994. I'll say a little bit more about that, but we've been doing this work in Baltimore, which now I like to call the flip side of The Wire. The Wire was about the immorality of the drug war, and what we have been showing for the last 20 years is how in those very same neighborhoods people can rise up to care about each other if we reshape the institutions that are governing us. So we've been building our work, as Carl noted, we've really wanted to base it on principles and values, as opposed to basing our work on a recipe for doing some sort of process or a technique. I really think that, so much of restorative practices, I say it's like jazz. You can never really teach every single note that's going to be played. And so the principles and the values behind this work are like the structure of the music. And if we as practitioners learn that structure, when somebody in a circle plays a note that's coming from way out of God knows where, we're going to know what the next note to play is that will keep that music cohesive, if you'll allow me to carry that metaphor through. So the basic principles are things that I think everybody probably on this webinar are familiar with, that relationships are extremely important and probably as important, if not more than anything else. That every person deserves to be treated with respect. That when we set up rules and we set up structures, that it's really important that they're fair. And this one, I think, is can't be overemphasized. None of them can be overemphasized, but that we set up, that we offer ways for that empower people to make decisions for themselves. We have created such a culture that is so based on turning to experts to tell us what to do. And in doing that, we are totally ignoring a huge wealth of wisdom within communities that goes untapped. And not only that, I think what many of us appreciate is that if we make decisions for ourselves, they're going to last longer and they're going to be more meaningful than if some expert comes in and tells us what to do. And the analogy I really like is anybody who has visited someone who's had surgery or has had surgery post the 1970s, you know that you get that clicker to manage post-surgical pain. And medicine didn't realize until the 1970s that if they let people decide for themselves when they get their pain medicine, that people will use less medicine and get more pain relief if they can decide for themselves. And I think it's a perfect analogy to letting people make decisions for themselves, that you get better, more lasting solutions with much less effort. And the other part that I feel like, actually my background is in neuroscience and animal behavior is what my doctorate is in. And I really come to this work with an appreciation of how restorative justice and restorative practices honor us in our biology as who we are as human beings. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the ways is because we are emotional beings. And everybody knows how we have leached emotion out of our criminal justice system. We've leached emotion out of our education system. We've leached emotion out of our workplaces. And we have done that to our peril. It is part of who we are biologically, and a really important part. And biologically, we are built to be in connection with each other. We have a limbic system that helps us bond with our young. So, for example, reptiles who do not have a limbic system, they don't bond with their young. So as we evolved and got a limbic system, we have neurological structures that are created to keep us in connection with each other. And obviously the connection of that with restorative justice and restorative practices is obvious. And the other thing that I really have appreciated over the last 20 years is that part of our biology as human beings is having a space to tell our story. So that's really kind of where we come from with doing this work. And I won't go through this. Our office provides a number of workshops related to the continuum of restorative practices, overviews, workshops on trauma, dialogue circles, mindfulness. I do workshops on emotion whenever I can. But what I really want to share with you is the work that we've done with community conferencing, which is a way to deal with incidents of conflict and harm, and also as an alternative to court. And the origins of where we get this work, I learned about community conferencing in 1994 when I was at a conference in Philadelphia. David Moore from Australia was presenting about their work in Australia using conferencing as a juvenile diversion. And they adapted conferencing from the Maori in New Zealand. So I like to say that what we've been doing goes from New Zealand to Australia to Baltimore in a straight line. And 20 years later, it's been incredibly powerful. And the process is deceptively simple. There's a trained, equally concerned facilitator that brings together the whole community of people affected by the conflict. So those who've caused the harm, those who've been harmed, and their respective supporters. So a typical circle is anywhere from probably 12 to 18 to 20 people, and could easily be more. And the structure of the conferencing people are probably familiar with is that first people hear what happened, then everybody in the circle gets a chance to say how they've been affected by what happened, and then the group decides how the harm can be repaired and prevented from happening again. And what David Moore talks about that I like is that the structure of this goes through the past, the present, and the future. And it's an incredibly powerful way to have a conversation. And we've been using, I like to say that we're indiscriminate about how we've been using this process. I don't care where it's used. I think this is about who we are biologically, that human beings will be in conflict. We are social beings. And so we've been using this in the criminal justice system as a court diversion, predominantly for young people, but for adults as well. And I should add that we've been using this for not just misdemeanor cases, but felony cases. In fact, we're in the process of doing a study of almost 400 felony diversion conferences that we've done. We've been using this in the schools as an alternative to suspension and arrest, and definitely as a way to crimp that school-to-prison pipeline, and to address disproportionality in the both school suspension and in criminal justice system of people of color. We've been using this in neighborhoods, in workplaces, in human services, and in organizations. When I first started doing this work, there were a lot of federal grants that required several community organizations to collaborate, like the Weed and Seed grants. I don't know if people remember that. But a number of organizations were required to collaborate to get a big pot of money from the federal government. And when they would get it, what often happened was those organizations realized that they didn't like each other, or they didn't get along with each other. And we've had some kind of famous community conferences around some of those cases. It can be used for planning. We've done a couple of interesting traffic planning issues in Baltimore using conferencing, and also for reintegration following incarceration or following military service. I mean, the possibilities really are pretty endless. What I want to share with you that I think is incredibly heartening is that after 18 years of doing this in Baltimore, 18,000 people in Baltimore City have safely and effectively resolved their own conflicts and crimes using community conferencing. I think the message to the world and to us as human beings is it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter how much money you make, what color your skin is, how old you are, that if people have an appropriate and helpful structure to resolve things themselves, they're able to do it. Of all the conferences that we've done, there have been about 3,000 of them. 94% have resulted in not only the group coming up with a written agreement, but with them being compliant with those agreements. And I hasten to add that 96% of the young people that we've diverted from the juvenile justice system using conferencing have been youth of color. And in Baltimore, it's predominantly African-American youth. This is just some data that came out in 2013. I think everybody's familiar with the extent to which there is such a racial disparity in young people who get suspended. And it's, you know, it goes all the way down to preschool. There's racial disparity in suspensions. And we've done reoffending studies and basically are finding that there is 60% less reoffending when young people go through conferencing as opposed to going to court, and all of this at 1/10 the cost of court. So it's hard to argue with those data. I mean, we've had these data over 18 years. It's been incredibly powerful, and when we present this to the state, it's sort of like, well, how can you afford not to do this? And yet, it's still a struggle. So, what I want to just take a moment to walk people through is to give you an appreciation of why I think this is so powerful, and why it has to do with not where we live or anything other than who we are biologically as human beings. I had the incredible gift in my life to work with a brilliant, like Einstein-level brilliant psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins, who died in 1991. He was largely ignored. He's still, most people don't know about him, but he had his finger on the pulse of what makes human beings tick. And what he did was he drew from Charles Darwin in 1871. And what Darwin said is that mammals and human beings evolve to have emotions for very important reasons. Like emotions, we have them because they help us survive. And the way that they help us survive partly is because we've got these facial expressions and we can communicate with each other. But that's not, Darwin said, that's not the most important reason why we have emotions. That the most important reason why we have them is, Darwin said that they serve a preparatory function, that they prepare us to act in a way that help us survive. So what I want to do is just walk us through, these are basically the set of innate emotions that human beings, if we're born intact, this is what we all have across the planet. And if you'll look at that picture, that's a picture of facial expression of an emotion that actually, there was no word for it. It's that look that when you smell something bad. Is that easy to see? Carl, can you see the picture well enough? Good. It turned out we had a vice president who had that expression on his face an awful lot. And what Tompkins called that expression was to smell. And the way that the smell biologically motivates us is to stay away from something. There's something out here that stinks, and our biological response is keep that the freak away from me. The closer I get to it, the more offensive it is. Then we're born with something called disgust, which is like, bleh. And the motivation behind there is to get rid of it. It's an escape response. You ate that salmon, you thought it was delicious, it turned out it was sitting on the table a little bit too long, and so 3 hours later, you got to get rid of it because it's hurting your system. We're also born with anger, and everybody knows that anger, when you're angry, your pupils constrict, your brow knits, you can see your enemy ahead of you very clearly, your heart's pumping blood into your muscles, your teeth are gritted, and that prepares you to attack. Okay? Fear motivates us to run, to get the hell out of there. People may have heard the expression that you're so scared you shit a brick. Well, law enforcement people, police will tell you how often, amazingly often, that when they confront people, if they're terrified, their bowels will evacuate, which is to lighten the load so you can get the heck out of there quicker. All very adaptive, right? We have sadness, which you look at that baby and it motivates us to get comfort. And then there's shame, which is kind of that kicked dog look. It's this deflation. And Tompkins had, I think, an amazing insight into shame, which biologically, he said, is triggered when we've had a positive bond or connection with someone or something, and there's been a perceived barrier to that connection. That's what triggers shame. And so the motivation behind shame, that deflation, is to seek to restore that connection. We're also born with this reset button called surprise. Like, I better orient. I better stop, look, and listen to what's going on here. It's really important. And then we have two positive emotions. One of them being interest, which motivates us to engage. If we had an education system that was simply based and founded on maximizing interest in students, the rest would be easy. This is what motivates us, our feelings. And the last is joy, which motivates us to affiliate with each other. So I appreciate you hanging in there with this, but let me tie it into how it relates to restorative justice and practices. What are people feeling when they come to a circle after their car has been stolen, or they've been beaten up, or whatever else's harm has happened? People are feeling disgust and dismay and rage and terror sometimes. And look at how people are motivated when they're feeling those emotions. That's what creates conflict. The motivation that is associated with our biological emotions. And so people start to talk about what happened. And then all of us who do circles know that once people start telling their stories, the tears start. And now look at how the motivation is shifting from being in conflict to beginning to seek comfort. And there's something really remarkable that happens in so many community conferences, which there was a First Nations Huron woman who called it a moment of collective vulnerability. And there's this moment of collective, almost shame that, you know what, we're all responsible for what's happening here. And it's not just ever about the person who caused the harm feeling shame. It is about the entire group beginning to be connected in their responsibility and vulnerability about what happened. And sometimes in a circle, you can actually feel that sense of deflation. And at that point, people are actually surprised because that kid who they wanted to go to jail because he stomped on this man's truck and keyed it. All of a sudden he's shocked because he actually, after this conversation, is now caring about this young man. And then we ask the final question, which is, what do you want to do to repair the harm and prevent this from happening again? And that's when emotionally things have shifted incredibly. And people are actually interested in each other. I mean, we had this man who really wanted this kid who stomped on his truck to go to jail for years. And once he heard from this young man and from his parents who had been divorced and everything that they were going through, when we got to the agreement part, the man offered to tutor this kid. He found out that he was going to be the first male in his family to graduate high school. And he said, I want to tutor you to make sure you do that. And then he said, if you graduate from high school, I will pay for your college. Now that's a shift from rage and disgust to interest and incredibly engaged interest. So this, to me, sums up what I think is so powerful about conferencing and about so many restorative practices, is that deal with conflict. It's not about victims and offenders. It is about a community of people who are in conflict because they are experiencing negative emotions about each other or about an event. And what the process allows them to do is to transform those emotions, to give voice to them, and for them to transform into something different, which is the positive emotions that motivate us to cooperate with each other. And to me, that's the essence, and to me, that incredibly explains a big part of why this work is so powerful. So I hope that makes sense to folks and doesn't feel like too much of a diversion. And so I guess I would just like to wrap up by just saying a few things about things that we've learned along the way. I have certainly, I've learned a lot of things from my colleague David Moore in Australia and from colleagues and co-workers in Baltimore and across the world. It's just been an incredible journey. And I think that one thing that really surprised me in 1995 when I first brought this to police and judges and educators and community organizers in Baltimore, what surprised me was when I described what we wanted to do, everybody said, you know what, that makes sense. And I thought, wow, we've got it made. This is going to be easy. Police are frustrated because they keep arresting and rearresting the same kids. And public defenders are frustrated by the court system, as are prosecutors. Everybody's got their own kind of vein of frustration with how things are working, and they were so open to doing this. And I thought we were home free, but we were anything but. People being interested and willing to do this, and an institution's ability to really shift how they operate and actually do it are two different things. And I was painfully surprised by that. And I got to say that after 18 years, we still have somebody in our office who every week visits the police and visits the prosecutors and visits our referral agencies to remind them to make referrals. It's been like a rubber band. If we stopped showing up, there's a sense that it would just spring right back. And that's incredibly frustrating. And I think that, one thing about doing this work that David Moore and I wrote an article about this, I think it was in Contemporary Justice Review in 2000. But we learned the hard way the importance of separating out the process that you're using from a program to implement that process. It's one thing to talk about circles or to talk about community conferencing as a process. And people get trained all over in different processes. What I think is sorely lacking are programs that allow people who are trained to plug into them and to practice their skills. And I mean, to be able to be practitioners. I would say 90% of the work between training facilitators and building a program, 90% of the work is in building the program. It is incredibly hard work. And I think that's partly why there aren't way more programs, at least in this country. And so we have always found it helpful when we have our peer learning community, we have a separate time to talk about a case study and then another time to talk about program implementation issues, because the frustrations there are endless. And the successes are really sweet. I think the other thing that I really wanted to mention is that in building the program and in developing relationships with whatever referral partners they are, it's about the relationship. We don't even, with all the cases that we get diverted from the courts, we don't even, it's probably a little dicey to even say this, but we don't have an MOU or anything with them. We have met with them consistently over 18 years to make sure that they understand why we're doing what we're doing and to make sure that they can connect it with how it's also helping them. And so I got to say that like 2 months ago, there was a stellar moment in our 20 years of doing this, because for the first time, about 5% of conferences don't result in an agreement. And in this one, actually, the participants ended up fighting outside the library where the conference happened. The conference ended. It wasn't successful. They went outside and there was a fight. And the facilitator found out the next day from the prosecutor that she might be subpoenaed. And this was the first time that had ever come up. And so we immediately contacted the head of our juvenile division at the prosecutor's office. And I said, hey, Gavin, one of your ASAs, assistant state's attorneys, is talking about the possibility of subpoenaing a facilitator. And he immediately said, not on my watch, no way, no how. You may not have legal protection, but you've got moral protection. And I will never let that happen. So I really say that to emphasize how important it is in doing this work to develop, no matter who it is that you're getting referrals from, to have a very close relationship with them. And I think I'll probably stop there. I could talk about a lot more things, but so stop sharing that.
Thank you, Lauren. Really, this has been really, really rich and very helpful. And I'm hoping that this has generated some questions from those who have joined us for this conversation. Let me start off, as people are starting to process, and we'll catch those and start working with them. Or the Q&A, I'm sorry, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But Lauren, you've given us a lot to think about here, and I just want to highlight a few things that I found particularly important for this conversation, I think, and that is, I loved RJ is like jazz. That's interesting. We don't learn it by reading it. We learn it by playing the music. We have to play the music. I mean, sure, you can read some jazz, but it's really, the best jazz players are learning through playing, through practicing, and through the ear. And I think that's been a struggle because a lot of folks want to standardize, professionalize, get this thing in. What are the frames? What are the boundaries? How do we make sure everyone's accredited to a certain level and all of that? But we know the dangers that come with that, because some of our best facilitators may not be folks with the educational or professional requirements at all. They're the ones that are playing jazz by ear, and they're really good. And so how do we work with that? I'm sure you've had some of that pressure along the way,
I'm totally fine with it.
Exactly. But what do you say to folks who want to push the whole movement into that sort of standardized, professionalized, the sort of way of most fields of discipline, so that it gets to the point of, trivialization, banalization, to the point where, everything's broken down into small pieces, and you have only certain frameworks and certain techniques in which to do your work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing, it comes up, I think the cycle for me seems to be about every 5 years, somebody's like, shouldn't we be credentialing? And so I happen to be a licensed psychologist, and I went through that certification process, and I know that licensing exam had nothing to do with, had no bearing on how competent of a psychologist I am. And I also know that maintaining that credential is about money. And so anybody who's involved with a profession that does it, I will just ask them, have you been involved with any credentialing process? And do you feel like that really secured quality within that profession? And I've never heard anybody actually say yes. I mean, now maybe, I don't know, maybe in medicine that's the case. I'm not sure. I've certainly had a number of doctors, this CEU junkets that people go on, that doesn't make them better doctors. So that's one of my pushbacks. And I think the other pushback is the spirit behind this work is that this is about people, and this is, it needs to always belong. I think it always needs to be connected and belong to people, and never to put barriers between monetary or any other kind of barriers for people to get access to this, to doing this work, or to even, benefiting from it. But I usually push people to tell me how they think this is really going to guarantee better process. And I've yet to hear an argument that ends up resulting in me feeling convinced.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, our staff, I really don't care what people's education background is at all. We've kind of come to feel like the best facilitators are people who are willing to unlearn, people who are genuine in their dealings with, no matter who they're talking with. If they come across as being really genuine, it's incredibly helpful. And John McDonald from Australia, who was one of the original people who I learned about this from, he would say, you got to know how to read the play, mate. You got to know, you're sitting in a circle and there could be 3-5 conversations going on, and you got to know how to read what's going on. I don't know any education that teaches you that.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, I think that's a strong argument, and it's a continual tension. We've gotten a great question from email, actually from Mike Hinton.
Hello, Mike.
So Mike says hello, and he says your work has been beneficial in making a real difference in the community, particularly around the victim offender type conferencing. And for the young people, my question relates to the issues that we hear of in the news about the riots and policing as part of what could be considered as a systemic failure. Are you doing any work with the town, city officials, and healing any of the hurt and harm caused by the unrest?
That's a great question. And, certainly this is a particular moment in history in this country in terms of there's a lot of hope that what's happening around the country will dismantle the problems that have gone on with law enforcement and with our criminal justice system. It was interesting and sad, I thought, what happened in the wake of the Baltimore uprising, because there was this massive influx of people coming in with a little bit of money to fix big problems. And so as an organization, actually, for a while, we decided to back off because I didn't want to be part of any of that. To me, it wasn't about the uprising. It was about the 50 and 250 years before this that led up to the conditions that created Freddie Gray having died in police custody, and that created, the neighborhood where he's from, where people don't have jobs, where there was an influx of money for housing and jobs in that neighborhood. But in the end, it didn't have an impact because all the jobs were too far away for people to get to. And there's no reasonable mass transportation system in Baltimore. I mean, the issues are so systemic. But getting to, Mike, what you're saying about the police, we have over the years actually, whenever we can, and we've had a couple projects where we have convened dialogue circles with police and people in the community who are not the community leaders. Like people in the community who typically have trouble with the police and who the police have trouble with them. So last fall, about a year ago, we convened some circles with young African-American men and police officers in one particular neighborhood. And we set it up, we were doing a series of 3 dialogue circles, and immediately the conversations got very real. And the young men are like, why do you harass us? And the police are like, why do you run all the time? And the kids said, because we got weed on us. And the officers are like, well, if you just drop it, we won't do anything. And the kids are like, well, yeah, well, you're saying that, but started naming other officers. In fact, between the second and the third conversation, one of the young men, that exact same scenario happened. I mean, I can't tell you how often the Freddie Gray scenario happens, where eye contact is made with police officers and somebody runs because they know what's going to happen next. And then there's a chase, and this kid got chased down, and he acknowledged he got roughed up a bit, and he acknowledged that he spit in the face of the police officer, and they put him in a van, and they took him to an alley, and they beat him up, and he ended up in the hospital. Young people started talking about getting anal cavity searches right there on the street. I mean, the things that have been happening are more pervasive than people realize. So what happened, like, out of that series, you know, this is one step at a time. And so what we heard from that group of young men and police officers, we interviewed a police officer about 2 months later, and he said he was in the drugstore, you know, the convenience store, and he saw one of the young men from the dialogue circles who was with his friends, and he wasn't going to say anything to him because he didn't want to make his friends feel like he was in with the police. But the young man on his own came up to him and gave him a hug. So, you know, I mean, we're trying to do some things. It's just going to take a lot of work. What I would love to do is to be part of to set up with the police a non-internal restorative justice practice for police misconduct. And we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are you starting that conversation? Is there any openness to that conversation?
In some places,
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're working on it. It's going to take a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, these are huge questions. Is there an ongoing space where there's dialogue happening between law enforcement and the community, other than, you know, if you instigate certain ones? Is there an ongoing space in Baltimore where that's happening?
I mean, there's been amazing things now. I mean, I keep hearing about healing circles that are popping up that are neighborhood based, which is awesome. There's one that happens right in Freddie Gray's neighborhood once a month on the first Sunday of the month. There are a number of, and you know, some of it is connected with us and a lot of it is not connected with us, that the people using circles as a way to sit and to give voice to whatever's going on with them.
Right.
So some of those things are happening. There was just a Unity Bowl. So it was a football game between police officers and people from the recovery clinic in Freddie Gray's neighborhood that just happened on Sunday. I got to say, there actually is there are a lot of pieces of things that are beginning to fall into place. So, you know, it's got to be both. It's got to be from the ground up, and then some of the institutional things, you know, something was just launched today to address police contracts, because the extent to which police are protected through their contracts, there's got to be a way. As much as most police officers are doing an amazing job, we still have to find a way in this country to address police misconduct. And I would love for there to be a space for that to be restorative. I'll just say also that we're working with the ACLU in cases where there was a death related to that was of a civilian in contact with a police officer. They are trying to see if we can do conferencing for some of those after there is any possibility of litigation. We haven't done any of these yet, but we're starting to look into that.
Wonderful. Really great. Thank you, Mike, for the question. And I'm just encouraging others, please send your questions through. We're going to start, we're going to take them as they come. One question that comes here right away from Claude in Canada. Are your conferences voluntary, or are some of them mandated?
We won't take any that are mandated. That cuts into the principle of letting people decide for themselves. So now, there is a certain amount of coercion if you say to somebody, either you're going to go to court or you're going to do this circle. But we don't do any systematically mandated conferences. We had, over the years, people have tried to slip them in, and we've tried them a couple times. They're just not the same. Mm-hmm. The emotional involvement in it is not there.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another question from Dawn. How do you decide who comes to the table? I.e., if participants disagree about who should be there, if some people aren't willing to come, etc. Do you do pre-meetings with all or some? And how do you provide quality assurance for volunteers? That's another question there at the end. Yeah.
So preparation is really the biggest part of the process. We talk with every participant because first, transparency about the process is an important principle. You want everybody coming to the circle to be very clear about what it is that they're coming to. So we let them know, like, look, this is a way to handle this. Maybe instead of going to court or instead of being suspended, here's what it's going to look like. If it doesn't work out, we're going to send it back and it'll be handled the way it normally would have been handled. But we let people know that, one, we say this is a process for people who are interested in trying to make this better, which is a little bit of an Aikido move. And some people say no, they're not interested in that. And so this isn't really the right process for them. But once they say they have any interest in trying to make it better, we say, so what we find is most effective is to include everybody who's involved in and affected by this in deciding and figuring this out. And so they know that everybody and their respective supporters are going to be there. So Dawn, I guess to your question, if somebody says, well, I don't want that person there, one of the things we'll say is, sometimes people say that because they don't feel safe if that person is going to be there. So we'll say, who would you like to bring with you to help you feel more comfortable about sitting in that circle? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, people can bring their pastor, they can bring a grandmother, they can bring whoever they'd like. And a lot of times that alleviates it. And if somebody is adamant, like, I am not going to come to this if that person comes, it's up to them. But what we will do is we'll tell the person, we're going to go to everybody else and see if they're interested in trying to resolve it without you there. So, and it's up to them. It's always up to the group. So, we had a case, there was really a virulent racist on the block. That was just really traumatizing a lot of families. And he was like, I don't really want to come to this initially. And we said, we're going to have this meeting where people can talk about the issues because people are very concerned about what's going on here. And as soon as he heard that there was going to be a meeting, he said, okay, I'll come, because he didn't want them to come together and talk without him there. So, the principle is really to define what we're doing and not defend it. And as soon as you tell people, well, you don't have to come, that immediately releases, a lot of times well, wait a minute, maybe I do want to come.
A little bit of reverse psychology there, yeah.
So, people are just, a lot of times we have this culture where we want to complain and we want to fight. And as soon as somebody doesn't do that, some people are like, what do I do now? They don't have to come, but they will know that there's a potential of this meeting still happening. Yeah. And the other question was about quality.
How do you provide quality assurance for your volunteers? That might be connected to the conversation we were having. So how do you define, quality assurance when you think about the volunteers you use and prepare them and train them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's so much in there. Our training is, we say it's in two parts. The first part is a 2-day learning about the principles and the mechanics of how to do this. And part 2 is doing an apprenticeship. So, it's one thing to learn it by sitting in there for 2 days and then doing it. I mean, I've been doing it for 20 years and I'm still learning so much about it. So we ask people to do, if they're gonna practice this, they sign something that says that they would complete an apprenticeship successfully. And that is to observe 2 conferences and facilitate 3 conferences. And there's a lot of debriefing and discussion after that. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of that, we have a conversation about whether or not this is a good fit for them. A lot of people go through it and they're really on a good path for developing their skills. And some people go through it and it's just too much against their grain to not be the one fixing it, or to, it's hard for some people to not insert themselves in it in ways that aren't helpful for the process. So you have to get through an apprenticeship. And there is a chance that at the end of that, we may say, either you need to continue in the apprenticeship or maybe this isn't a good fit. And then quarterly, we have peer learning meetings with the facilitators. Now, I should say that also, at this point, 90% of our cases are done by staff facilitators. And we have our office deliberately set up as an open space so that everybody can freely talk to each other and hear each other on the phone. And so in the course of a day, we are supporting each other and learning from each other about our cases. And then I also built in what I call the campfire, that if something happens that has really upset you, you don't know how to handle it, it's just immediate and you need to talk about it, all anybody has to do is come into our office and say, I need a campfire. And everybody knows that if you can drop what you're doing, you drop it, and we sit in a circle and we talk about what's going on. So there's a lot of things built in so that we can really help each other.
Fantastic. I mean, sounds like a great example of trying to run an organization restoratively too, which is another question, because there's a lot of organizations involved in restorative justice and their internal workings aren't restorative, or their internal structure isn't. And so this is a great example of that. And also
we're not completely, we're still learning on that front.
Sure. Aren't we all? But I like the campfire idea as a care for the caregiver, a place to debrief the trauma that as facilitators we might be receiving secondary or vicariously. Yeah. Just another question in here. Does it matter who initiates the conference? Victim or offender, or I guess any one of the stakeholders, or do you get them from all different corners?
That's a good question. So our court referrals are always initiated by the prosecutor's office. But, what we did at the beginning was we sat down with the lead juvenile judge, prosecutor, and public defender and worked through with them a way to, how are we, who's going to be able to refer? And everybody agreed that the prosecutor should be the ones. And there's a whole process that they do. They agreed to do a mutual postponement at the arraignment. And, but I mean, we don't really care. Some of it is limited by that. I mean, the prosecutors don't want public defenders referring every case. Mm-hmm. And so everybody agreed that the prosecutor's office would make those referrals. I should say that I also, for 11 years, have been handling murder cases. Not instead of going to court, but 10, 20, 30 years later, we have a contract with the corrections, the Division of Corrections, to do this. Mm-hmm. And they request that those are only initiated by victims' family members. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is because, one, you don't want offenders using this as a way to game the system or to game their way out of into a shorter sentence. And also, it's just not fair. If a victim really has no interest in this, it's not fair to just call them out of the blue and say, hey, do you want to do this? So in the serious crimes cases, it's always initiated by the victim's family.
Good. Still inviting more questions. If there are, we'll take a few more moments here. Lauren, one thing that, I loved the stuff around biology. That was really helpful. And I think attachment and the new neuroscience stuff is teaching us so much about the brain that's helping us move the conversation from the magic of restorative justice to sort of, this is what's happening. I think it's quite vindicating for us. It's sort of a vindication that there was something here. There was some science here, maybe, actually, to what we're trying to do. But I wanted to move forward to, one of the things that struck me is, your stats, and I've seen those stats, and we have seen those stats. They've been researched in numerous places, not only here in North America, but elsewhere. The success is really visible. And when you compare the stats to the current system, and yet we keep having this struggle in sort of the system taking that turn, making that turn around the corner, that sort of critical mass flip. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about that in the sense of why. Because we want to talk about structural change, I think, in this movement. And so, I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear from you. What do we think is overtaking the stats and the amazing stats that keeps that system sort of having a life of its own, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's the inertia of a freighter kind of thing, I guess. There's a lot of people's jobs tied up with this. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of money, and there's this really weird thing that people people think that going to court and having a judge, it's kind of in our culture of handing things over to experts. Mm-hmm. That there's a comfort in that. Yeah. I think there's so many things, but right. People are like, no, if we call them, they'll be like, no, we need to go to court with this. And so what we'll say in the preparation is, have you ever been to court? Yeah. And most people have, and we'll just say, so how did that work out for you? Because if it worked out, by all means. Mm-hmm. But most people have had a horrendous experience. And so that's where the weird magic is. Like, why do people hang on to, mm-hmm. These authoritarian, costly, biased, ineffective structures as a way to do justice? That's a mystery. So I'd be curious to hear what you.
Well, I think we're up against a narrative change, a major narrative change, which then changes our worldview. Our social discourse and narrative around it is so much steeped in this that I think we're actually trying to shift a whole perception around how the world works and how we play an agency in that, this and can as individuals as well as collectives. And yeah, it's interesting. And then, of course, what we do know from structures that build a life of their own, the bureaucracy, is made to keep itself alive. And it has to keep morphing and reiterating. And so I think it's built into bureaucracy and structures of that nature, the sort of to dismiss non-conforming data, mm-hmm. and search for the conforming data.
Yeah.
And the media then, of course, helps build that narrative in television, that we sort of, this day in court concept, I call it, is out there all the time. And folks think they're going to have it.
It'll be really interesting to see how what's happening in the country right now mm-hmm. is going to affect the ability to build restorative justice more. Right now they're just throwing such small amounts of money at it compared to massive amounts of money. And I think that as this country has been operating in this delusional bubble, mm-hmm. that this is a country that is built on, liberty and justice for all. And that delusion, I think, is popping.
Yeah.
That never existed.
It's imploding. Yeah.
And so as that delusion disintegrates, the hope is that people will call for something that is meaningful.
Yeah.
In terms of education, in terms of justice, in terms of jobs, in terms of everything.
Dawn's jumped in here again, and this is great. We've got some practitioners who continue to pull us. We're bouncing between the macro and the micro. I'm curious about the conference format. It seems to be based on the stated 3 questions. I think, what were those? What happened?
How have people been affected? And what do you want to do to repair the harm and prevent it from happening again?
That's right. This sort of past, present, and future. Is this adapted for non-crime situations, like you said, when you apply to neighborhood planning, reintegration? If so, how are the facilitators trained for this?
Exactly the same way. And this is the funny thing that is so hard to explain to people, because I think when we talk about restorative justice, people just put it in this victim offender box. And that's partly why I went through the emotion piece, because whether this is about people who are a community of people who are in conflict, whether there's been an arrest or whether there's just, there's a neighborhood conflict that I actually videotaped it. And if you go to our website, which is communityconferencing.org, you can see clips from this conference. And what happened is in this neighborhood for 18 months, the neighbors called the police on the kids playing in the street. And the neighbors couldn't, and they were damaging people's cars, and they were swearing and keeping people up at night. There were adults that were going to factory jobs at 4 a.m. and were being kept awake. And they were told by the community organizers in that neighborhood, there's a different way to handle this other than calling the police. And the neighbors are like, yeah, whatever. And so for 18 months, they kept calling the police, and it never got better. So finally, the neighbors came to the community organization. They said, all right, we want to do that meeting you've been talking about. And so after about 2 weeks of preparation and knocking on doors, 44 people showed up, young and old. The adults couldn't figure out why the kids didn't go 1 block away to a beautiful huge urban park to play football. Why do they have to play in the street right in front of their houses? And so the structure of that conference was exactly the same. It started out with hearing what happened. So the young people just started talking about playing ball in the street. And for the first time, in the first part of that community conference, the adults heard why the kids don't go to the park. And they said there's dog crap at one end, and we get beat up by the drug dealers at the other end of the park. And the adults had never, in the 18 months of calling the police, had never asked the kids why they don't play in the park. So within the first 5 minutes of the conference, they found out why. Everybody got a chance to say how they were affected by it. And when it came time to figuring out how they're going to fix it, Don Fergus, whose beloved Cadillac was damaged by the kids, and they actually poured sand in his gas tank once, Don Fergus said, all right, me and my friends will chaperone you going to the park so you can play football and you won't get harassed by the drug dealers. And the next day, Don and his friends showed up, and 21 kids showed up. And within 3 weeks, there were 64 kids coming 4 days a week to play football with Coach Don, and his friends. So it was exactly the same structure. They heard from the kids what happened. Everybody was saying how they were affected by it. And then that group of 44 people in that basement of the library figured out how they were going to fix it. They ended up creating a football league run by 40 adult volunteers from the neighborhood that included 4 teams of 25 youth. They raised money to get uniforms, and that football league lasted 10 years. That came out of one community conference. And if you go to our website, there's a video there that actually you can see part of it. But that's a long way to say it's exactly the same structure, whether they're all about conflict, whether it's crime or not. So you just start with hearing from the people who've been involved in creating that conflict, what's been going on, and then just go around the circle. So Dawn, I hope that clarifies.
Claude's here with another question too, taking us back to some of the argument which we've often heard, and I'd love to hear you respond to this, because I think this is often in the mind of many folks. Do people argue that conferences are too soft on offenders, and they will learn their lesson more with a prison sentence as opposed to more discussion? Possibly in response to the mentality we were talking about just a moment ago.
Oh, if I had $1 for every time I've heard that, we could fund our program. And the reality is that young people tell us all the time that it was harder to do that community conference than it was to go to court. In Baltimore, kids look at going to court as a joke. They don't give a rat's ass, really. In juvenile court in Baltimore, 50% of cases are dismissed. So what are kids learning? They're learning that it's basically a coin toss as to whether anything's going to happen to them, and that they can do stuff that's bad enough to get arrested, but most of the time, that ties into the myth of what our criminal justice system is about. It's kind of become this bifurcated, nothing happens, nothing, until all of a sudden then you're in detention and you're down this spiral of not being able to get out of it. So that's how we reply. It's the participants absolutely think it is way harder to do a community conference than it is to go to court.
I think one research done a decade or so ago with juvenile offenders, when I was first working in victim offender conferencing within the criminal justice system, was saying 70% said this was, they used the word punishment. This was more like punishment than the court system, but they were using the word punishment as in this was harder than appearing before the judge. This meaning sitting down and facing the people that you've harmed and having that conversation. But I think also in light of that question, Claude, I would also say prison, there's a lot of research out there that says prison doesn't teach people a lesson. In other words, if it did, it should show results, and the data should show that kids aren't going back into prison, not just kids, anyone isn't returning back to prison. And yet we know that about 60 to 70% of folks who've been in prison or been through the court system recidivate, go back again. And so it's clearly not teaching them a lesson. What it is teaching them is a whole bunch of other things, but it's not really the lesson to say, I need to stay out of this. For about 30% who don't, go back in, yes. But there's also a lot of factors that go into the change of those 30% that are beyond the prison. In fact, research indicates only 2% change in prison while they're actually there. And usually that's through a religious conversion. The other 30% who don't return, it's a whole multiple set of factors that they think about and act on inside or outside of prison that keep them out of the system in the future.
And that's actually part of our what we push for, because initially the system typically just wants to use this for first-time offenses. And we really push hard back against that, because our state Department of Juvenile Services has done research and shows that most first-time offenders don't reoffend if you don't do anything. And our argument is, give us the 12-year-old who's got 8 or 10 priors, because whatever you're doing isn't preventing them from reoffending. So why not try something different? Our prosecutors sometimes will get really upset, like, well, what if they go through conferencing and then they reoffend? We can't have that. And I'll just say, well, does that ever happen if they go to court? Do they ever go to court and reoffend? It's like they want to put some criteria on this that they don't abide, that doesn't apply to what they do at all. So.
Absolutely. We've been working on a police RJ initiative here in Harrisonburg, and we get the same thing from the police. But what if they reoffend? And one of our allies within the police force always comes back and says, yeah, well, what happens when you arrest them and take them through the court? Do they ever reoffend? Yeah. So, let's try something different.
Same thing.
Yeah. Dawn comes back. Let me try to segue back to the macro. Do you have an example of how an individual conference was able to address a systemic issue or perhaps result in actions towards systemic change? Do you believe that in the big picture conferences significantly address systemic injustices?
I can tell you, like, even in that neighborhood conference that ended up in the football league, now, systemically in that neighborhood, that was significantly shifted. That was a neighborhood where people of different races and ethnicities did not talk to each other. People did not talk to each other across generations. And it was amazing that now white kids and African-American kids were now playing football together and talking with each other. There were white adults who would go walk out of their way to go like a block out of their way to get back to their house to avoid going by the African-American kids hanging out in the street. And they stopped calling the police whenever anything would happen. They started to talk to each other. So, that's changing people's use of the system. And, I think beginning to change the systems. I mean, we've had police who have sat in conferences and have seen the impact of it. And instead of keep arresting people, they have just said, look, there's another way to do this, and gotten them. So that has started to happen. It's a really good question. I think that there have been some things that have happened, but I'll have to think about it as we only in the couple minutes left.
Well, and I think part of it's about our theory of change, and we're having to wrestle with that as the restorative justice field and movement. And that is it one person at a time, if you will, building a critical mass till it pushes up and changes the system? Is it changing legislation and the institutions? Is it both and in concert? I mean, you obviously embarked on, back full circle to your 18 years doing this. You've embarked on a long-term project, Lauren. So I don't know if you've articulated a specific theory of change that you're working with there, but you've certainly wanted to saturate as many sectors as possible in the city. So maybe that is your theory of change, with a hope that there's some critical mass. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth on that, but that I'm wondering if you want to comment on that.
No, I mean, that's definitely been the hope. And I also think that, I feel like we've got golden seeds, but if the soil isn't fertile, it doesn't matter how good the seeds are. So, I mean, if there's been any theory, it's about spreading out a lot of seeds and finding the fertile ground and going with where it's going to grow. I can certainly name a number of things that have happened where we've tried to make systemic and institutional change. Most notably, when Baltimore started imploding the high-rise public housing developments, and they were relocating residents in particular neighborhoods, and those particular neighborhoods were up in arms about not wanting those residents. And I tried really hard to get our housing department to let us do circles with the families that were in those neighborhoods in dialogue with families that were going to move there, so that it wasn't just a theoretical who are these people moving here, but it would be real people talking with each other, and we couldn't get them to make that investment. And they had all sorts of problems. I mean, I think it could, I mean, it's really hard to get the institutions to make some upfront investment in this stuff.
Lauren, I think we're about ready to close down. I'm going to turn it over to Jordan here in just a bit, but thank you very much. This has been really useful. I know I have some more questions, and but it looks like we have covered the questions that have come through, and I know your time is very precious, and so thank you for making time to have this conversation. It's continuing to open some really important questions. And thank you, all of you who've been with us. And I'm going to turn this over to Jordan now and take us to the end. Jordan?
And I just want to say that anybody could contact us at the center if they're interested.
Wonderful. And I don't know if you're willing to put the slides forward. We'd be happy to put those up along with the podcast if you're willing to do that.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Carl. Just a really, really wonderful conversation and lots of good information and concepts that we need to continue to work with and work through. As Carl mentioned, my name is Jordan Detweiler-Michelson, and I'm currently a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I work as the graduate assistant to the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice. So at this point, I have a couple of announcements about the Zehr Institute and upcoming events that I'd like to share with you all. The Zehr Institute's goal is to spread knowledge about restorative justice and to be a resource to practitioners and facilitate conversations and cultivate connections through activities like these conferences and webinars that we've been hosting. So we offer space to explore frontier topics like the intersection of the arts and peacebuilding and the ways that trauma and restorative justice are connected. And so, yeah, if you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to stay connected to the Zehr Institute and stay involved in these discussions around restorative justice and other topics, we have had an exciting lineup of RJ webinars this fall, and those recordings are available online on our website, and we would love for you to join us for the remaining webinars. The dates are listed here. Starting in January, we will have Jeff Frum, and he will be talking about restorative justice and trauma healing awareness. In February, we'll be joined by David Karp and Karen Williamson on the topic of restorative approaches to sexual assault on college campuses. In March, the date and the title are still pending, but we will be joined by our very own Carl Stauffer for a discussion that we look forward to. And in April, we'll be joined by Cheryl Talley around the conversation, the connection of neuroscience and restorative justice. All of these webinars take place on Wednesdays at 4:30 Eastern Time. Please join us and share the link with others who may be interested. We are very delighted to announce the upcoming Zehr Institute and Summer Peacebuilding Institute's upcoming conference, RJ, Restorative Justice in Motion, Building a Movement. And the goal of this conference is to explore our joint roles in building a global restorative justice movement. And together we will imagine the transformative power of restorative justice at the intersections of social and political change in our societies. So please come join us June 14th through 17th. And right now we are taking proposals that you can submit for workshops, seminars, and panel presentations at the conference. The deadline for proposals is December 16th. All of the information is available on our website, the cost of registration, and the accommodations. That information is available online. The Summer Peacebuilding Institute is also coming up. This takes place every summer. It's a great series of seminar-style classes that are intensive classes focused on specific topics. 3 topics or 3 classes of particular interest as it relates to the field of restorative justice. We'll have a class on strategies for trauma-informed organizations with Barry Hart and Michaela Lance Simmons. We'll have a class on the foundations of restorative justice with Lorraine Stutzman-Umstutz and Johanna Turner. And lastly, a class on truth-telling, reconciliation, and restorative justice with Carl Stauffer and Fania Davis. So if you are looking for more opportunities to go in depth with some of these topics, or if you know people who are, then I would encourage you to check out the website listed here on this page. There are full course descriptions available for each of these courses and the other courses being offered at SBI this summer. So please check that out online. Another course that we're really excited to offer next fall, Foundations for Restorative Justice, will be offered online as we continue to pilot different ways for people to join us in the classroom and in different seminars. We'll be offering a full semester-long course online through this Zoom platform. So if you are interested in that, if you're able to beam in and join us in the classroom, then please email Sarah Roth-Schenk and go ahead and mention this webinar and explore that as an option. One thing that I want to talk about and share is the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, the STAR training. It's a research-based training program that brings together theory and practices from neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, spirituality, and restorative justice to address the needs of trauma-impacted individuals and communities. It's a great program for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. And there are several opportunities to receive STAR training. The level 1 training will be offered this upcoming February, and then again in May. Both of those trainings will be offered at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And the STAR level 2 training will be offered this spring in May, and then the following fall, we already have one on the schedule to take place. Both of those, again, are at Harrisonburg campus for Eastern Mennonite University. Lastly, if you want to go deeper with your restorative justice practice or theory, the Center for Justice and Peace Building offers a graduate level certificate course, which allows working professionals to continue working while also focusing on studies. It's a great opportunity to reflect on your work and to increase your knowledge and skills. It could be something that you need to revitalize your vision of your work or apply your work in different fields. We also offer a graduate certificate in restorative justice in education. This is offered through our MA in Education program. And 2 ways to go about this. You can pick up a graduate certificate, or if you are taking the MA program in education, then you can develop a concentration in restorative justice in education. We're really excited to be offering this, and the Masters of Arts in Education program has been putting this forward, which I think is the first in the nation to do so. So again, check out that program online at our website for more information there. Lastly, the Center for Justice and Peace Building offers a full master's in conflict transformation. This is a practice-based curriculum exploring nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict. A lot of emphasis on restorative justice, some of these interdisciplinary fields that we've been talking about with psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, and community development. More information can be found at EMU's website if you look for CJP and the graduate program there. Finally, CJP, the Zehr Institute are all part of Eastern Mennonite University, which offers undergraduate programs, including peace building and development. They offer several graduate programs, such as the Masters of Arts in Counseling, Education, Business Administration, biomedicine, and conflict transformation. Eastern Mennonite University also has a seminary and is the host to the Summer Peacebuilding Institute and the STAR program that we learned about earlier. So please, if you're interested in those programs, go ahead and check us out on our website. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it back over to Carl, who will take us out.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and please be in touch. Thank you, Lauren, for providing us with your contact details, and again, for your time. Please, we'll be taking a break, of course, over this time, but we'd love to have all of you who've been with us today back for our January webinar. All the best.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.